needs no introduction, but anyway, I'll try a very short introduction. Professor Blommaert is Professor of Language, Culture and Globalization and Director of the Babylon Center at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. He's one of the world's most prominent social linguists and linguistic anthropologists, and a leading expert on sociolinguistic globalization theory, as you all know. Professor Blommaert's work focuses on questions of power and social inequality in language and society, emerging from globalization processes from a discourse analytical perspective and from an ethnographic perspective. Among his many publications, I would like to mention The Sociolinguistics of Globalization, which came out in 2010, and Ethnography, Superdiversity, and Linguistic Landscapes, Chronicles of Complexity, which was published in 2013. Our conference addresses topics relating to moving texts, changing languages in changing societies in the age of globalization are at the core of Professor Blommaert's work. So we are really proud and honored to have him with us. Professor Blommaert is going to open the Moving Texts Conference with a speech around the following question: does context really collapse in social media interaction? Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and without further ado.
Introduction, and thank all of you for being here. It's wonderful to be in Aveiro. It's my first visit to this place. I've been in other places in this wonderful country, and it's a discovery. University as well, so it's a real pleasure, being here. And those are not just empty formulae that one says at the beginning of a speech. We have lost a little bit of working time, so I'm going to try to catch up a little bit so that we can still have coffee, and remain within the schedule more or less. And so the story that I would like to bring revolves around a question of, in its most general sense, a question of meaning and diversity. Now, a conference like this, in which we find people from a variety of disciplines, all concerned with the instability of meaning-making systems, if I might formulate it in that very, very general way. In my view, at least when I was thinking about what to present here, ought to consider that central issue, because that is, the issue is exactly the one that I outlined, I think. How, under conditions of increasing or escalating or increasingly recognized diversity, how do we maintain meaningful social action? And the exercise that I want to do, of course, is we're going to look at an entirely new area, or at least an area that's been around for very close to a couple of decades now, the internet. But it's remarkable to see how little deep theorizing there has been on the internet as a social phenomenon, anthropological phenomenon, social linguistic phenomenon, discourse analytic phenomenon. So I'm going to, in a way, address one of these innovations, a theoretical innovation from internet studies, more specifically social network studies. The notion of context collapse. Now, I'm a very, very experienced lecturer, and even if the PowerPoint wouldn't have worked, I would have been able to do the lecture because I have a handout, which is I hope you all have handouts. 3-page to sheet in, but it might be helpful. And it also, at the end of the handout, it might be interesting, you mentioned you find some extra resources. There is a website on which you find all the data that I was discussing, and also the draft working paper of the story that I'm going to try. In first sketch a little bit of background, where do we come from, why now, how did we get here? And of course, in my case, it has to do with development, or at least thinking over decades about the social linguistics of globalization, knowing that most of the social linguistics we had was based on ideas of the nation state. So until quite recently, when we thought about social linguistics, we thought this about local areas that were clearly, they were enclosed village, an island, a nation state, and so on and so on. And of course, in the age of globalization, that is no longer the issue. And in my own work, that has given, maybe some of you know, occasion to develop ideas about mobility. So language is mobile, speakers are mobile, meanings are mobile as well. And so the moment they start moving, they change, or at least all sorts of things happen to them, and we need to explain them. Another thing was complexity. Now, when you look at stuff that moves, it's necessarily unstable, and unstable means it's a little bit more complicated than the old ideas we had about stable text, stable speakers, stable languages, dialects, and so on. That basically remained where they are, okay? It's no longer the case. So complexity is another thing. Then we found a word basically to organize that complexity, or a number of words. One of the words we developed was the notion of super diversity, new form of diversity that has to do with, on the one hand, new forms of migration, so after the end of the Cold War, that basically explain why we are here in the present say, group, the community here. The way in which the group is organized is a post-Cold War phenomenon. The second thing is exactly the internet. And historically, these two things really coincide. Early 90s is the moment in which the borders open and you get entirely new forms of migration, not just in Europe but all over the world, one. But it's also exactly the moment when the internet enters into our lives, rendering all sorts of things highly complicated, new, and hardly understood as well. So this is basically where I come from. And where I've recently been is in a little project, a big project, which I labeled Durkheim and the Internet. It can also be found on that website. I found resources for this paper on. It will become a book, I guess, and essentially what I tried to do there was to look at how new insights in this deep social linguistic analysis of these new phenomena that we call superdiversity, how it may lead to new social theory. So not just new social linguistic theory or anthropological theory, but social theory. Basically, a new way of imagining our social environment, the world in which we live, and who we are. So this is the background. Okay. Now with that background, of course, one more thing, the last line there, more and more, I'm going to make an important point already. When we try to understand superdiversity, one of the problems we have is that the notion itself basically removes all sorts of assumptions that we used to have about individuals, about modes of communication, about what they do when we communicate. It removes them. So in other words, we may find ourselves in interactions with individuals whom we don't know anything about. So the idea that we can presuppose backgrounds, languages, lots of skills, lots of competence and so on, is no longer there. Because of mobility, because of complexity. So we need to abandon that. And increasingly, the argument that I am developing is, well, we have to look at actions, right? At actions. Not only interactions, but every action is an interaction, of course. So this is a truism, and of course we get that from one from Dr. School of American sociology, but a bit broader than that as well. A school called symbolic interactionism. People like maybe the names Goffman, of course, you're familiar with Goffman, but also Blommaert, Anselm Strauss, grammar theory, and also individuals like Sikora. They had an enormous influence on Bourdieu as well. So a lot of Bourdieu's work is deeply influenced by this as well. And so this central idea was to look at actions and how these actions basically make meaning, or in these actions you will see meaning emerge, and not just meaning, but identities. So in other words, they basically say, or at least a lot of research basically starts from meaning and from individuals as identities, and then moving to an analysis of action, they basically turn it upside down. So we start from action and then see what comes out of action in the way of meaning and in the way of identities. So this is a little bit of background, and it's with this background that I address this notion. It has become, for those of you who are familiar with the literature on social media analysis, it's a recent branch of course, but it's in England almost a decade old already. And here's a very important notion, or at least a notion that has become very, very widespread, very widely used as an assumption. And I give you two little definitions. There's several definitions, but they all basically overlap, or they give you the same idea. The idea is basically, that the notion stands for a situation in which, for instance, on Facebook, we launch a message, we write something, okay, which we believe is for grandma, or for our, I don't know what, for our neighbors, and it's being read by people in the United States. I live in Belgium, so the United States is really far away. So we don't know who the audiences are anymore. And the idea, the notion that has been developed, context collapse, so that notion basically stands for problems that emerge from exactly that sort of thing. So in this world of the internet, we communicate, but we don't really know whom we are interacting with. And that may give rise to difficulties, to tensions, and so on. So there is, in a way, trouble on social network sites. There's a problem. And here is how this problem is being defined in this literature. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I don't have a screen here, so I use this one. Sorry. There is trouble on social network sites. There is a problem. So this notion stands for a problem. The problem is, basically, when you're on social network sites, you don't know whom you're addressing. So you don't know also how people may react to the stuff you're doing. So meaning has become a little bit different, meaning making. It leads to uncertainty, to frustration, basically because normal communication has been out of order. Okay? So when they identify a big issue, these multiple audiences, you don't know, it is a problem because we can't use our assumptions about normal communication. And I need to find the assumptions. The assumptions are very widespread. It's not only these people who use it, but look at the assumptions. Basically, these assumptions refer to a sort of idea that normal communication is offline, it's one-on-one, so just me and you and no one else. Okay? Well, me and you, me and one individual. That's so dyadic, ordinary conversation, let's say. In an activity that we know well, a linear activity. For instance, I asked you how late we shall have lunch. Very transparent activity. Now, the third point is we do that within a world of sharedness. So I know you well, you know me well. For instance, I know that you speak English and I speak English, and we share English, we share ideas about when we need to eat, etc. Yeah? So this is normal communication, and then the notion which they developed refers to a problem, and that problem is essentially a problem of diversity. Okay? Because this refers, or at least these assumptions refer to a sort of old, nostalgic ideal of interaction in a village. Okay? In which everyone knows everybody, we say hi to each other, you know exactly, who's dating whom and so on. We know everything about it. And it is that world that has been lost, and now essentially we have these multiple addresses, so we have diversity. So essentially context collapse is a problem of handling diversity. And a very fundamental assumption is when we are on social network sites, we get into trouble because we are encountering diversity there. We're not alone, we don't know these people, we are highly diverse, and so on and so on. And of course, here's my question. Really? Is that really the case? So is this really a problem? If it is a problem, in which way is it a problem? And so on. Okay. We've examined the assumptions. Now, from social linguistic anthropology, and also no doubt from translation studies in the world. So discourse analysis, even literary studies, we at least I believe that we do better. For instance, we know that they overgeneralize. So when you read these definitions, or at least the ones that I've shown, it is about people doing communication with audiences. Right? Now when we examine real communication, we observe that people general sense, communicate, they do specific things. For instance, they ask a question, or they do storytelling, right? Or they lecture right now. We are communicating, but after this lecture, when there's a break, we will still be communicating, but doing entirely different things. So the mode of communication, specific forms of communication, are usually overlooked. And so the actions that are the stuff of communication are usually overlooked. And another thing is, whenever we do real interaction, we don't address a model, not normally. There are people who do that, who address the world. But in general, we have a very precise idea of who we are addressing. So we don't really speak to audiences, we speak to addressees. A very good word, from social linguistic analysis and linguistic ethnography and so on. The addressee. We have a pretty precise idea, even if it's wrong. We don't, in general, organize our interaction in relation to unspecified audiences. We have very specific audiences, i.e. addressees, in mind. And another thing we know from a few decades of research is that the notion of context is not given. You may have read in, very quickly go back here, I find this a very strange expression. People from different contexts. It is as if all of us are in a context. Okay? And then if we meet, all sorts of things happen, they collapse. While, of course, we know from social linguistic research, linguistic ethnographic, interactional research, and so on, that context is made. So whenever we really interact, we assume a number of things about context. For instance, we assume here that this is a lecture, okay, but even so, what really happens in the lecture needs to be established moment by moment. And we do a lot of work in view of that. I do a lot of work and you do a lot of work. So in other words, contexts are never pre-established, same with identities. And identities are okay. There are ideas about identities like nationality. Of course, you won't change nationality during this lecture. I won't. Okay? And I will not change gender, I promise you, during this lecture. I hope you also remain. Okay, yeah. But we do change identity in the sense, for instance, that we have become somebody else after this moment of interaction in the way, for instance, of knowing each other, but also having ideas about each other. For instance, I may have ideas that you guys are a really smart audience, okay? That you're really on the ball. You may have an idea, at least I hope, that I'm on the ball. Smart. Okay? That I know basically what I'm doing, right? You may also have an idea that I'm an academic, right? And maybe also that I'm a nice guy. Let's hope we get there. Those are identities. And they're very important identities in the sense that they create friendships and networks, etc., etc. Over and beyond gender, nationality, and what have you. So these identities, again, are not pre-given. They have to be made, they have to be organized, they have to be interactionally ratified. For instance, I can try to be a nice guy, at least, I'm really doing my best to be a nice guy to you. But if you decide that I'm not, I'm not. Right? So you give me an identity, not me. Okay? So I'm only doing half of the work, you have to do all this. So these identities, again, we have long histories of research on these identities, and we know that they're not pre-given. And so this is an assumption. And so here's the upshot. Let's take action seriously. I already mentioned it. Let's take action seriously and see what emerges from action. So we're now engaging in an action, we're doing something which we know what we have ideas about, all right, and expectations, and let's see what comes out. Nothing yet has been established. So we need to go through the action and then we see what comes out. For myself, this has led to a thing which I call a four-line, instead of that four-line social linguistic methodology for investigating diversity, if you wish, in interaction, and here it is. So we start from interaction. We look at how, in reality and in detail, specifically people interact. Okay? And we know that there is no interaction without relationships. We already had a relationship before we started interacting. Right? For instance, we all came to this conference. So there are already a number of assumptions that we share, that we have about each other, etc. And so we need them as a prerequisite. We also need to use them while we're interacting. For instance, I have to stay an academic, right, for the next 40 minutes, after which I can become something entirely somebody interested, for instance, in trees, or in wine, or in the Tour de France. So I make and then outcome as well. So at the end of the interaction, we will have ideas and identities, actually, that we don't yet. These relationships will always involve identity work. So in other words, when we think about interaction, it's never not about identity. So identity is always an element of interaction. Right? So the action we're looking at is an identity building action. Then here also, so when we look at these modes of interaction, these actual, real, very specific modes of interaction, we are looking at the deep fiber of society. So we're looking at the things, the very things that make us social beings. There's an old word that was made by the sociologists from the early 20th century, Zibbel, Georg Zibbel, and it stands for the evolving, the ongoing renewal of what we call society. So we saw society as a verb, and so we make society in every action that we perform with others. And finally, very important, specific forms of interaction will create specific forms of sharedness and also specific forms of relationships and groups. So in other words, this will create an entirely different relationship between you and I, and later when we're having a beer and we talk about wines or the Tour de France. Right? Specific forms of interaction always create specific forms of sharedness and specific forms of group. So this is my approach, and we have our problem, which is handed down, from the School of Social Network Studies, people like Dana Boyd. Let's now do a very simple exercise. Let's examine their ideas about context collapse empirically. So in other words, let's start looking at some data. And so here's the case. I now refer to your handout. So in your handout, you have some elements about the materials that we have been using in making this argument. The case is an interaction on Facebook, so the biggest, or at least in the West, the biggest social network site is Facebook. And Gosha Java, so the person with whom I have been doing this work, she works with us and she investigates the online and offline resources of emigres from her country, Poland, in the Netherlands. So one of the things we found was a huge Facebook group with lots of discussion for specifically immigrants from Poland in the Netherlands, and it's huge, so 50,000 members. Okay. Now, a number of you will already say, hey, hang on, we're going to talk about diversity, now they're all Polish. Yeah, hang on. Yeah. All right? Just let me finish my sentence. The event that we're examining is a discussion on Facebook. Like all of us have had discussions on Facebook, but a pretty long one. So it went on for 5 days in March last year. And it was launched by a journalist, a young woman. We nicknamed her Ala. And she was born over there. But at the age of 4, so she was very, very young when she immigrated in the Netherlands. And she became a journalist there. She's working for a Dutch TV station. And so she does something which many of us do, or at least that happens a lot on this Facebook group, a request for assistance. So she asked the group, this large community, so she was going to make a documentary on the labor conditions of agricultural workers in the Netherlands from Poland, right? So she was inviting people or asking people to volunteer to collaborate with her, like giving interviews or telling stories about the labor conditions there. It's a very simple thing. Okay. It's a huge conversation. So those of you who are already online and have already found it on my website, so again you find the link here at the end of the second page. It's a huge conversation involving 193 actions. The actions are, of course, three things in Facebook. There is one update. So we always start with an update. We know what an update is. Anyone not on Facebook here? Okay, yeah. Listen very carefully. Listen very carefully. And stay away from it. Yes. So one update, and then you have main comments, 79 main comments, and then you have replies to comments, 113. So there's quite a bit of activity going on. A huge amount of activity, actually. It's page upon page upon page. And it's all in Polish, all right? And so again, you will say, okay, diversity. But the interesting thing is, a lot of it is about Polish, right? About different forms of not just the language, but also what it is to be Polish. So here you have diversity within an ethnic or ethno-national group, of which we would assume that it's very shared, or at least you know that maximally shared. No, there's an enormous amount of diversity being articulated in these debates, and we shall see a number of examples of that. Now, our last update, I already gave it in a nutshell, so it's a request for assistance. If you think about speech acts, you know, it's a pretty transparent sort of thing. And one of the things we know about speech acts, of course, is it is a specific action type. So a request is different from an order or an announcement or something like, I'm having my 5th cup of coffee this morning, or my flight is delayed by 25 minutes. So very different action types. And every action type sets the general action frame, as we know. For instance, if I ask you a question, the action frame is, I expect an answer. Right? And for instance, if I ask you a yes-no question, are you going with me to have a drink? Okay. Then the action frame is yes or no. So whenever we organize an action, we also introduce a frame for how to behave within that action. So the frame in general, it is the desired thing is to respond, and you know, from Allah's view also in a constructive way, okay? And it also means on Facebook that you have to stay, as I say, on topic. She talks about agricultural labor, so don't go into the diamond trade. Right? That's a different thing. Stay where you are. And then also an order of indexicality. That's a notion that might be a bit cryptic for you, but it basically refers to all these norms that we have about how to do specific forms of activity. For instance, here, this is a lecture, and so within the order of indexicality of the lecture, I hope we all assume that I am speaking now, and I'm the one who should speak, and you should stay very, very, very calm. Or at least you can nod and you can smile and things like that. So the order of indexicality. But also, for instance, that we do this in English, or at least it was announced to be in English, so expect me to do it in English and not in Dutch. Right? So there are all sorts of expectations, little and large norms that we introduce whenever we engage in interaction, and we have some ideas about these norms, and we will see how important they are. But it also defines, of course, this action frame also defines what counts as being a legitimate participant. And here we get to this notion of the troll. You must be familiar with that. Trolling. Like, you know, Mr. Trump's supporters on Twitter. Trolling. They are not legitimate. They try to break into an interaction in order to basically ruin it, sabotage it, boycott it, etc. So there is an idea of who is participating well and who is welcome when he or she participates in specific ways. Finally, also, it also creates, in that sense, a moral universe, in the sense that we can be outraged, very upset, when somebody does not behave according to the rules. For instance, when somebody starts using obscene language, or goes off topic, or attacks you personally, and things like that. So we have a moral idea about it. And all of this here, one assumes, is very clear. However, all hell breaks loose, and it breaks So here's the opening. So this is the update, and I let you read it. So she simply, those are the English translations. You find the originals online. So she introduces herself very short way. I'm a journalist looking for immigrants working in greenhouses, so in the agricultural industry. Now, very, very shortly, the second reply she gets, because the first reply was, oh, great, wonderful. Second one she gets is this one, fucking great journalist who makes spelling mistakes. The thing is that in her writing, the Polish writing, indeed, you know, she wrote awkward phrases, the punctuation, but also, you know, specific words that actually don't belong there. So she was a bit out of register. She clearly sounded non-native, right? Okay. This one instantly jumps on it. So here's diversity, yeah? Super diversity even. And then for the next hour, you get something like 48 replies to this, and over the next 24 hours, it will grow to, I think, 79 replies to this big debate about, you know, writing well, speaking well, what it is to be Polish, how important it is to use the right language, how nasty this person is, you know, the point, the spelling mistakes out, and so on. But the interesting thing is, after an hour, so after 47 moves of basically very heated, very emotional debate, she edits her update. And so here she gives an explanation for her language. Right? Now here's the order of indexicality. Look at what she writes here. It seems to me, however, that communication in this group should be in Polish. So she flags the expectation, the normative expectation that when I'm here, rather than on a Dutch website, you know, I have to do it in Polish, and I try. So what follows, I already specified a simple request, you know, she wants people to collaborate with her in the making of a documentary, okay? Should lead to very clear things, but we already seen, you know, that it really very quickly gets on the wrong track. So what follows is all sorts of different lines of actions, not one line of action. It's people saying, oh yes, I would like to collaborate with you, or no, I'd rather not. No, all sorts of different actions, legitimate actions if you wish, and all in all, you know, her conversation has been relatively successful. Many people still offer their participation and so on, but lots and lots of so-called illegitimate actions, off-topic, all sorts of individuals moving into entirely different issues, directions, etc., etc. Also trolling.